Allowable growth, I actually ran the bill 309 for 4 years in the Senate. I listened earlier for Representative Burns' remarks. I like to go over those a little bit myself. If we're going to look at funding, we got to look at it as a whole. He talked earlier about having this rural discussion committee, task force meeting, and that's fine, that's great. But the thing is, you cannot just take away funding to the schools without them having some kind of ways of contraindicating that or whatever, because the funding goes to the schools. And one thing too, if you don't do funding to schools, you don't fund the schools. Again, going back to the local government, X amount of dollars to run the schools. So if they don't get it from the state, if we don't give them for the 2% allowable growth, the likelihood that they're going to raise your property taxes will be there. So again, we have to talk about the whole picture. It's so easy to say, no, we need to not fund the schools by not giving 2% allowable growth. Schools still need money. And if they can't get it from the state, and they need it in their budget, they'll look at the other alternative, and that's to raise your local property taxes. Thank you.
And 3 minutes for you as well.
Wow, there's a lot to talk about here. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the school aid funding formula, because the school aid funding formula is a combination of both property tax and state aid. So this ties in with one of the property tax bills that the House sent over to the Senate, because if you're truly going to provide equal education in the state of Iowa and mitigate those differences between property-rich districts and property-poor districts, one of the best ways that you can do that is have the state buy up more of the state aid that is currently paid by property tax. The House actually had that in one of their property tax proposals, which would have been great for education, because it would have actually lowered the burden of inequality between property-rich districts and property-poor districts, and it would have been a more stable source for schools. So that's one issue, is the formula itself. Second, specific to education reform, it was the one chart that I brought tonight, and I wish I would have distributed copies of it. But you know, combined district cost in the state of Iowa is now in the last about 15 years is more than double the rate of inflation in relationship to other programs. Our change in weighted enrollments, we're down about 25,000 students in the state since 1999, and our scores in relationship to other states continue to decline, our test scores. So basically what we have is a scenario where we have less students, more money, and lower scores. So I agree with Senator Wilhelm, you got to look at it the whole picture. And one of the things we need to do in any education reform package is we need to talk about the fact that, as Representative Burns said once again, you just can't dump money at this thing without having some changes in the policy, and hopefully we can get that in a future question. The last thing I want to mention is the allowable growth rate, because Senator Wilhelm in some respects is boasting a little bit about the fact that she's been very involved in advocating for that for that 2% allowable growth. Well, you know, I did some comparison shopping, and I think the audience might need to know this, that the difference between Senator Wilhelm's record on voting for 2% allowable growth and then having the governor cut it by 10%, basically, is a major difference from when I was serving in the legislature in 2001 and 2000 and voted for a 4% allowable growth rate, completely funded, and we had the budget guarantee for small schools that had declining enrollment. There's a gigantic difference between those two records on education. And I think there's a major difference between saying you're for allowable growth, not funding it, or then having to cut it, or voting for allowable growth that's actually larger, and the buck stops here. We funded it, the schools appreciated it, and we were getting good education results at that particular time.
And 1 minute for rebuttal.
And you're right, I ran a 2% allowable growth. I did not cut the allowable growth. The governor did a cross-the-board cut, I think it was in October or November. One thing about government, one thing about the state versus federal, we can't be in the red on June 30th. The first year I was there, we made some drastic changes. July 1st started, first of the budget. We started getting, the governor started getting into the revenues a few months later, realized that there was a different drop-off of all taxes that were coming in, whether they were corporate, income taxes, everything. There was a dramatic concern that we're going to let up, potentially be in the red or close to be the red, so the governor made the decision to do a 10% across-the-board cut. So then why, 2 years later, we fought for at least 2% allowable growth and had to end up at 0 as a compromise.